This is Lesson 1911, The New Republic. How did the National Convention attempt to introduce cultural change to the new republic? And we've got College Board Topic 5.4, The French Revolution. Explain the context in which the European states experienced crisis and conflict from 1648 to 1815. After the execution of Louis XVI, the radical Jacobin Republic, led by Robespierre, responded to opposition at home and war abroad by instituting the Reign of Terror, fixing prices and wages, and pursuing a policy of DeChristianization. I've got a couple of issues with that statement. Number one is it doesn't reflect the actual sequence of events. Also, as we shall see, Robespierre was actually not a fan of DeChristianization, and there were ultra-revolutionaries in the National Convention who were more radical than he was and whom he had a difficult time controlling. Revolutionary armies raised by mass conscription sought to bring the changes initiated in France to the rest of Europe. So we'll see that a little bit. And then we've got College Board Topic 5.5, The French Revolution's Effects. Explain how the events and developments of the French Revolution influenced political and social ideas from 1648 to 1815. While many were inspired by the revolution's emphasis on equality and human rights, others condemned its violence and disregard for traditional authority. Places, well, we have France, and the time frame is between 1792 and 1793, and we already have the guillotine. Key concepts of the new republic: the levée en masse. Also, there's DeChristianization. We have this idea of natural borders. We have the Festival of Reason, and we have the new Republican calendar. Key people of the new republic: the National Convention. That's 749 people. We have these groups called, for example, the Mountain, the Jacobins, which we're already familiar with, the Girondins, which we're already familiar with, and of course, Maximilien Robespierre. The King's Trial. In August and September of 1792, you had new elections to this newly elected body, the National Convention. This was the body that would declare the Republic into existence on September 22nd. And again, these newly elected deputies tended to be young. They also tended to be middle-class professional men, doctors, lawyers, etc. There was still no new constitution for this new republic. There were simply too many other emergencies to deal with for the National Convention to hammer out a new constitution, and there was also too much feuding between the Girondins and the Jacobins. There would not be a new constitution until the summer of 1793, and even that would not be put into effect. By then, the Girondins would be purged from the National Convention and out of the way, and the various crises in France would be too dire for the Jacobins not to have a constitution, at least not to have one written and voted for. So let's review the political makeup of this new National Convention. There were 749 deputies total. The middle section, this gray part here, was called the plain. It's sometimes derisively called the marsh, which almost kind of sounds like the swamp. They weren't affiliated with either of the two most vocal parties on the sides that struggled against each other for power. On the right, you had the Girondins. They were moderates, as we have learned. Their leader was Jacques-Pierre Brissot, whom we have met. They had been staunch supporters of the war, as you remember from lesson 1910, and they liked the idea of a republic, but they wanted to control its trajectory, make sure it didn't go too far off the rails, and they were staunch defenders of the sanctity of property and property owners. The Girondins were very distrustful of egalitarian ideas, especially the ones that supported universal male suffrage with no property qualifications. They had dominated the previous legislative assembly, and they wanted to do likewise with this new National Convention. On the left, you had the Jacobins. They were the Girondins' main rivals for power. They were very egalitarian and for universal male suffrage with no property requirements. They were much more enthusiastic about the Republic than the Girondins. The most radical of these Jacobins congregated way up in the very highest seats on the left side of the assembly hall. So you had to look way up to see them. It was kind of like looking up a mountain at them. And the nickname stuck, the Montagnards, or the Mountain. They were very close to the 48 sections of Paris as well as the Sans-Culottes. The most prominent Jacobin leader was Maximilien Robespierre. The Girondins hated Robespierre. Robespierre had opposed them when they had advocated for the war, and he had come down in favor of overthrowing the king, which the Girondins had not wanted to do, and which they did only very reluctantly and grudgingly, if you'll remember. The Girondins blamed Robespierre for stirring up the September massacres that we learned about back in lesson 1910. What do we know about Robespierre? History teachers often just repeat what they're told and condemn Robespierre as a monster and a villain. We aren't going to do that here. Robespierre's history. Robespierre had come to Paris as a fairly successful lawyer. He had been a representative of the Third Estate way back in the Estates General back in 1789. Back then, he had just been one of many deputies. He didn't really stand out. And he had also been a member of the National Assembly when it had formed. Robespierre had not been a member of the Legislative Assembly. The rules, which he himself had introduced, said that you couldn't serve in the Legislative Assembly after having served in the National Assembly, if you remember that from lesson 19.9. But Robespierre had remained a member of the Jacobin Club and had published very frequently. Over the course of time, he had gotten the attention of a lot of people. He was known for his incorruptible nature. He even earned the nickname the Incorruptible. He was known for his self-righteousness, but most of all, he was known for his incredible ability to express the Jacobin position on any issue with incredible precision and clarity. It's like when you know how you feel about an issue, but you struggle to find the words that describe and explain your viewpoint just perfectly. Robespierre was really good at that, and he became the man that the Jacobins relied upon to do that for them. As a speaker, Robespierre was only so-so, but he did make a lot of speeches. Robespierre believed strongly in equality. He had opposed putting a king's veto in the constitutional monarchy back in the days of the National Assembly. He believed in universal male suffrage. He supported the nationalization of church property. He supported the rights of Jews, free people of color, and the poor. And Robespierre actually opposed the death penalty, ironically. Finally, you had the royalists, those who supported the king. There weren't royalists in the National Convention. The king was in prison. You were going to be elected to the National Convention as a royalist unless you were one in secret. The Girondins and the Jacobins faced off over what to do with the king who was in prison. Many Jacobins didn't even believe in giving the king a trial for treason. The Girondins still believed that the king could be useful in many different ways if kept alive. A safe was discovered in the Tuileries Palace containing 625 documents. It was a treasure trove of conspiracy against the revolution in the king's own handwriting. These papers showed the king attempting to bribe various deputies for their support. They showed secret plans with counter-revolutionaries and emigres. They showed him asking foreign countries to come and rescue him. They showed him encouraging his ministers to lie to the Legislative Assembly. Most shocking, they showed our hero of the revolution, Count Mirabeau, plotting with the king to restore the king to full power. Luckily for Mirabeau, he had died in 1791 before all of this came to light. At this discovery, Robespierre spoke before the National Convention and argued that the king must be executed. So Robespierre did a total 180 on his feelings about the death penalty when it came to the king. The National Convention tried the king, and Louis XVI appeared twice in his own defense. He was a disaster both times, and he was unanimously voted guilty of treason, 693-0. The real question was what to do with the king. Thomas Paine suggested exiling the king to America, but he couldn't get any support for the idea. We studied Thomas Paine at length back in lesson 19.9. He was the same guy who wrote common sense way back when that you learn about in American history. The National Convention voted 387 to 334 to execute the king. It wasn't about whether he was guilty or not. It was obvious to everyone that he had conspired against the revolution and against the Constitution. And it wasn't about whether people thought he deserved to die. There was no pathway in the minds of the French people after 1,300 years of monarchy by which the king could ever become just a French citizen or just a French prisoner or just a French person. As long as he was alive, the monarchy was alive. And as long as the monarchy was alive, it was, by its very existence, a perpetual threat to the republic. Practically speaking, as long as the king was alive, anyone with enough power could come along and overthrow the republic in the king's name, whether the king wanted them to or not. So the real issue was the survival of the republic. At the end of the day, no matter how they felt about it, the king had to be sacrificed. He had to die so that the republic could live. Louis XVI was publicly beheaded on January 21st, 1793. Afterward, they dissolved his body with quicklime. It was as if even the last remaining hint of the king and the monarchy he embodied had to be eliminated for the safety of the revolution. There was very little discussion of the king's execution in the press or among the people throughout France. It was announced, of course, but not deeply discussed. It was as if everybody knew that it wasn't for justice or fairness that the king was executed. It was simply necessary. It had to be done. Taking the war abroad. The French state had campaigned hard to recruit and indoctrinate its army of volunteer citizen revolutionaries in 1791 and 1792. They got its numbers up to about 350,000, but that wasn't nearly big enough. And it was hard to maintain that number because not every soldier was a true believer. So in 1793, the National Convention imposed mass conscription, a levée en masse. And that got the army's numbers up to 1 million soldiers by the end of 1794. It was the biggest army in all of human history. But a draft is like magic, as we will see. It comes at a price. For example, in the United States, we had to deal with the political fallout from the Vietnam War draft for many years. And we'll see the price that the French Republic paid for this levée en masse. After the victory at Valmy on September 21st, 1792, check out lesson 1910 for background on that, the French went on the offense. They attacked the Austrian Netherlands to the north, what we would today call Belgium. They attacked the German Rhineland to the due east. They also attacked Sardinia-Piedmont in the southeast, or you can call it Piedmont-Sardinia. It's up to you. I tend to go back and forth. By the way, we will learn much about this country of Piedmont-Sardinia's history when we study the Italian unification. And the French started off winning the war. French armies had territorial gains in all of these places. The ethical question is this: how do these conquests fit into your revolutionary principles about popular sovereignty? How are you going to spread this revolution? Are you going to annex places like the Austrian Netherlands, Savoy, and Nice and make them part of France? Or are you going to stick to your Enlightenment principles and grant them the freedom to exercise their own popular sovereignty and let them decide what they want to do? If you impose your own sense of what it means to be free on your neighbors, is that not actually a form of conquest? These questions were debated not only in the National Convention, but also in the popular press. And our Prussian-born revolutionary from lesson 19.9, Anacharsis Clotes, introduced a concept that really captured the imaginations of a lot of French people, and it will pop up again. He proposed that France needed to expand to what he called its, quote, natural borders, north and eastward to the Rhine, south all the way to the Pyrenees, east all the way to the Alps. And that would mean incorporating several of France's neighbors into France. The DeChristianization Campaign. How do you transform a people of, quote, Catholic superstition, unquote, into a nation of, quote, science and reason, unquote? How about a new calendar for starters? Enlightenment wisdom said that time should be measured in a rational and scientific way. It should represent a total break from the normal way people had previously measured time. Get rid of that old superstitious calendar that began with the birth of Jesus, where the weeks are built around Sunday, that's full of all of those religious festivals and observances. So you had the French Republican calendar. Year 1 began on September 22nd, 1792, the day that the Republic began. 7-day weeks became 10-day decades, 3 to a month. Months took on scientific names that reflected the nature and the weather. For example, December to January was called Nivose, which meant snowy. June to July became Thermidor, which meant summer heat. The new calendar eliminated all the Christian holidays and feast days and replaced them with festival days that commemorated the Revolution and or Enlightenment values. But the new Republican calendar had a hard time competing with the old system. On August the 10th, 1793, the one-year anniversary of the overthrow of the king, the French government held a massive pageant celebration. It was designed with all kinds of revolutionary symbolism by Jacques-Louis David, the great neoclassical painter. He was also a very proud Jacobin. The pageant had absolutely not one single Christian symbol. The new symbol of France was a non-Catholic symbol, a young female representation of liberty named Marianne, which was deliberately close to the name Mary. There were many cultural changes to mark the Republic's new sensibilities. Many people stopped using the formal French pronoun for you because that was typically used to indicate that another person was superior to you. People stopped dressing in many aristocratic styles, and playing cards came out with pictures of Enlightenment philosophes instead of kings and queens and jacks because those characters represented nobility. And about 10% of French towns renamed themselves after revolutionary ideals or people. More extreme actions. For the extreme Jacobins of France, none of this went far enough. They wanted to eliminate Christianity from France altogether. They launched a DeChristianization Campaign. For example, in November 1793, radicals within the Paris Commune used the Cathedral of Notre Dame to hold a, quote, Festival of Reason. In this Festival of Reason, they set up a temple dedicated to philosophy inside the cathedral. They put sculptures of the philosophes in the church. A young woman sat on a throne to represent liberty. Some said, though, that she represented the goddess of reason. A flame was installed to represent the power of reason, and it all came across as extremely sacrilegious to a lot of people. But the DeChristianization Campaign was actually a thing of the provinces of France rather than coming from Paris. Its leaders tended to be local Jacobins, town officials, soldiers, and deputies who were sent out on mission from the National Convention for multiple purposes. More on them later. These locals did such things as the following. They shut down churches in most of France. They invaded churches. They destroyed statues. They ripped paintings off the walls. They burned sacred objects in big bonfires. They melted down the metal from bells and other church objects for use in the war effort. Sacred objects were turned into, quote, useful things, such as broom handles. That was considered more useful than fostering illusion and superstition. They converted churches into useful buildings, such as storehouses and armories and stables, or even temples of reason. This rededication often involved blasphemous and defamatory anti-Christian rituals. Many priests were forced to resign or get married. and about a third of priests stopped practicing altogether. De-Christianizers often used shock, blasphemy, desecration, and destruction to intimidate the religious. I used to teach that Maximilien Robespierre was a driving force behind this de-Christianization campaign. In reality, Robespierre was very much opposed to it. Robespierre was very concerned that this campaign would alienate people and turn them into counter-revolutionaries, which it did. And the National Convention likewise never officially endorsed the de-Christianization campaign, although many deputies from the convention participated in it while out on mission. The National Convention left it up to local communes to decide for themselves whether they wanted to pursue de-Christianization. Those who drove de-Christianization saw the church as evil. They believed it was Christian superstition that was holding people back from lives of reason, rationality, and loyal citizenship. They viewed Catholicism as fanaticism, from which the revolution had to be rescued. In the end, the revolutionaries were unable to make these new festivals and observances stick permanently. The calendar stuck around until about 1805. But de-Christianization did sharpen the divide between revolutionaries and anti-revolutionaries. Some people who had been in support of the revolution before this turned against the revolution. When people did start coming back to church, there was a gender divide. Wives started to return much more quickly than their husbands did. And areas where the de-Christianization campaign had been particularly strong saw less church going than other places all the way up to the 20th century.